Mixed martial arts is a brutal sport, although you probably know that already, which is exactly why it doesn't pay to be a complete jerk inside the cage, especially if you're not sure about winning a fight. Well, unless you're Conor McGregor. And even Conor fell to the hands of the undefeated Khabib Nurmagomedov via a rear naked choke, although McGregor's loss wasn't enough to shut the Irishman up for good. Hello and welcome to our video countdown for today. This is MMA Edge, and we're going to be discussing the top 5 fighters who got bitten by karma inside the octagon. Number 5, Ronda Rousey versus Holly Holm. Ronda Rousey had gained quite a fearsome reputation prior to her fight with Holly Holm on UFC 193. The legendary female fighter was on a 12-win streak, and it looked like she wasn't going to get stopped anytime soon. Rousey was the overwhelming favorite going into that fight as well, coming in as a minus 1,200 favorite on the day of the fight. Unfortunately, all of Rousey's fame and success got to her head, and it showed. She barely showed Holm any respect in the press conferences before the fight, and even refused to touch Holly's gloves as the fight began. Rousey got hers though, as the overwhelming underdog. Holly Holm shocked the world when she knocked out Rousey in the second round of their fight, ultimately ending her winning streak after an impressive 12 victories. Holm followed her game plan of standing with Ronda toe-to-toe until she finally landed a well-placed left cross, followed by a left high kick that sent the former women's bantamweight champ crashing towards the mat. Now I'm guessing Ronda's gonna think twice about disrespecting anyone she gets into a real fight with next time, don't you think? Number 4, Nick Diaz versus Anderson Silva. Both Nick Diaz and Anderson Silva are very well-known names in the MMA world. It only makes sense to pit the two veteran fighters together after both of them suffered lengthy layoffs in order to see who would come out on top. Diaz had other things in mind though, aside from snatching the win from one of the greatest to have ever done it. Diaz has always been known for his brash and arrogant attitude, and this fight with Silva was no different. He rained down a ton of insults at the legendary fighter in their fight at UFC 183, occasionally dropping his hands and even plopping down on the floor as a sign of disrespect towards Silva. Diaz was obviously referring to Silva's loss to Weidman in UFC 162 as he mocked the former champion by mimicking his actions, which eventually resulted in Silva losing his belt. Silva, however, remained calm and chose not to respond to Diaz's constant trash talking. He simply chose to focus on the fight, which ultimately ended in giving Silva the win via a unanimous decision after a hard-fought battle. Silva's win was short-lived though, as both of them tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs after the fight, with the UFC and the NSAC ultimately overturning his win to a no contest. Despite how it all turned out, the fight still goes to show that you can't waste your time mocking someone inside the octagon, especially if they're as good as Anderson Silva. Number 3, Andrew Craig versus Rafael Natal. Andrew Craig, a formerly undefeated middleweight prospect, faced off against Rafael Natal, a jiu-jitsu black belt with a striking game to match at UFC On Fuel TV 4. Both fighters needed to win the fight in the hopes of someday advancing within the ranks of the middleweight division in the UFC. Now when the fight began, everything looked good for Rafael Natal until he got the bright idea of mocking Craig during the fight. Natal started dropping his hands and went as far as to even pretend he was hurt by one of Craig's leg kicks during the fight. Craig didn't respond to any of Natal's tricks though. He simply kept his focus on the fight and eventually knocked Natal out with a vicious right high kick in the second round of the fight. Now that's karma. Number 2, Nordine Taleb versus Eric Silva. Eric Silva, although not as popular as high-profile welterweights such as Robbie Lawler or Matt Brown, was pretty well known in his own right. His resume was pretty impressive coming into this fight with wins over the likes of Josh Koscheck and Takanori Sato. Nordine Taleb, on the other hand, wanted to prove a point by challenging Eric Silva in the hopes of landing a win over the feared Brazilian. When the big day finally came, Silva dug himself into a hole by doing the worst thing you could ever do inside the cage. tricking someone into bumping gloves with you. Silva intentionally extended his fist towards Taleb as a supposed sign of respect before pulling back his arm and trying for an overhand left. If you're going to do something as underhanded and as dirty as that, you'd better make sure you win. Such wasn't the case for Eric Silva though, as Taleb quickly bounced back on the second round of their fight by catching Silva's right kick and countering with a right hand of his own. Silva quickly crashed to the mat shortly afterwards, and the fight ended with his face glued to the floor after Taleb landed some ground and pound onto his unfortunate opponent. If you want to be a jerk, make sure you back it up, especially inside the octagon. Number 1. Anderson Silva vs. Chris Weidman 1. We briefly mentioned this fight earlier on in the list, but didn't really expound on it. This fight, however, definitely deserves to be number 1 on our list, especially since it was Silva's monkeying around which resulted in him losing his belt and his legendary win streak along with it. Silva amassed an impressive win streak prior to this fight and beat off all challengers who hoped to dethrone the unbeatable middleweight king at the time. It would be safe to say that all of Silva's success got to his head as he began to underestimate most of his next opponents. That proved to be a mistake for Silva, as the All-American Chris Weidman was not a man you could take lightly. Silva completely fooled around in the entire fight, constantly dropping his hands and even sticking out his chin towards his opponent in an effort to mock the undefeated Weidman. Weidman kept his head above water though, as he remained stoic throughout the entire fight, choosing to pick his shots and time his punches right. Everything fell apart for Silva in the second round of the fight when Weidman clipped him with a left hook. Silva pretended to be hurt from the hook and playfully wobbled his legs instead of keeping away from Weidman's line of fire. Weidman then followed up his attack with several more combinations and another left hook that hit the Brazilian flush on the chin. Weidman snatched the win after pounding Silva's face onto the ground, and the crowd erupted with shock as Silva's legendary streak was ended with a heavy dose of karma. And that's gonna be it for today's video. Thanks very much for watching, and please comment, like, and subscribe for more MMA and UFC content.